The classical anarchist, Proudhon, Bakunin and Kropotkin. Part 1. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon is one of the most important social and political thinkers of the 19th century. His ideas on anarchy, property, land and labour influenced almost all subsequent thinkers, whether they adopted them, adapted them or rejected them. Proudhon's background is that of the solidly provincial French peasant, although his father was an artisan rather than a farmer. Proudhon had the common anarchist suspicion of industrial society. His rural and provincial upbringing infused him with a vision of the ideal society that was never to leave him, despite his long sojourn in Paris. He had some formal education early in life, but because of family circumstances, he had to choose a practical trade. In his case, he chose printing. Some early works written as entries to an essay contest won him a scholarship, and he took himself off to Paris, where, in 1840, he produced the first work that attracted wide attention, his What is Property? What is Property opens with the ringing and notorious claim that property is theft. Startling and unambiguous as this phrase may appear to be, it doesn't actually mean what it is often taken to mean. It is not a universal condemnation of all and every form of property. What it condemns is property inasmuch as it is employed by someone to exploit the labour of others without effort on the property owner's part. Proudhon was quite happy to endorse a notion of property as the possession and use of one's own house and land and tools, inasmuch as these were employed by and for oneself, without, as he says, the exploitation of others. Proudhon, then, was not a communist, and his endorsement of a certain kind of property was to separate him from other anarchists. Proudhon believes that you have an absolute right to what you produce, a jus in re, but you do not have an absolute right over the means of production. That's jus ad rem. What is produced is proper to the producer. What it is produced from is common. The material of which anything is made is ultimately given to us by nature, and so belongs to all. Furthermore, our technological knowledge is also common. One might wonder why a producer has a right to his product, given that the material of which it is made has ultimately to be taken from the common stock, which belongs to all. In the making of his product, the producer has de facto arrogated to himself exclusively what, on Proudhon's premises, belongs to all. The objection, then, might be made that a producer cannot own what he produces unless he antecedently owns the material that is used in the production. An objection somewhat along these lines is raised by those with communist inclinations. Why, they ask, should we arrogate the product to the producer? Why not have means and ends both be common? This proposal Proudhon rejects. If the commonality of the means of production tends towards equality, the commonality of everything would, he thinks, be destructive of independence. And the importance of independence was a theme that runs throughout his work. Property, in fact, springs from man's desire to free himself from the slavery of communism, which is the primitive form of association. But property, in its turn, goes to the extreme, and isolated equality by the right of exclusion and increase, and supports the acquisition of power by the privileged minority. In other words, it leads to unjust authority, so writes Woodcock. Proudhon's position, then, is intermediate between two extremes. One extreme is communism, which gives us commonality of means and commonality of product. This preserves equality but denies independence. The other extreme is when property really is theft. Here you have individuality of means and individuality of product. This preserves independence but denies equality. Proudhon's position is that you should have commonality of means and individuality of product, and this preserves both independence and equality. In summary, then, Proudhon in What is Property rejects government, rejects unworked property, and advocates the organisation of society on the basis of free contractual relationships between workers, mutualism. Like Stirner, Proudhon valued individual freedom and was chary of associations and movements. Unlike Stirner, however, Proudhon was not opposed to society. If Stirner is the egoistic individualist, Proudhon could be said to be the social individualist. To Stirner, says Woodcock, the individual is all and society his enemy. To Proudhon, the individual is both the starting point and the ultimate goal of our endeavours, but society provides the matrix within which each man's personality must find its function and fulfilment. Proudhon believes, as most anarchists do, that man is inherently social, but that while this is so, his individuality must not be submerged in any form of social entity, not even in the family. Society is not merely an aggregate of individuals, but has its own character, which is distinct from its constituent elements. Marx was initially very favourably impressed by Proudhon's thought, and he wrote to him in 1846 to propose collaboration. However, Proudhon was wary of any form of association, and indeed wary of the idea of revolution as a means of social reform, and in his reply to Marx warned of the dangers of their becoming leaders in a new form of intolerance. Proudhon's response disappointed Marx and ended direct contact between them, and explains in part Marx's abusive attack on Proudhon in his The Poverty of Philosophy. There is a measure of irony in Marx's attack, inasmuch as Proudhon's position was an attempt to maintain a kind of dialectical tension between opposed and competing tendencies, an attempt one would have thought would have been music to Marx's ears. Woodcock remarks, and here it is worth emphasizing the persistence of the idea of conflict in Proudhon's thoughts. He lived for the struggle more than for the victory. At most, he sees a possible truce between the contradictory forces in the universe and in society, but stress and tension are inevitable and desirable. Proudhon took part in the February Revolution of 1848, but afterwards remarked that it was a revolution without ideas. Over these succeeding years, he directed his attention towards theory in practice, publishing a number of periodicals, standing for election to the Constituent Assembly, and trying to get a People's Bank up and running. Of these enterprises, the periodicals were successful. Participation in the Constituent Assembly and the attempted constitution of the People's Bank were not. Eventually, the Assembly tired of Proudhon's incendiary activities, and he was tried and convicted on charges of sedition and sentenced to a fine and 3 years' imprisonment. The 3 years, in what was, in effect, a kind of house arrest, gave Proudhon the time and the solitude necessary to study, think, and write. During his confinement, he wrote 3 books, continued to edit his periodicals, and even got married. Proudhon's 1851 work, The General Idea of the Revolution, portrayed the revolution, presumably a revolution with ideas, as a kind of natural and irresistible force, resembling the nemesis of the ancients. This idea of a fateful force as an agent of change was to become another standard element in anarchist thought, one echoed later by Kropotkin in a Darwinian mode. The French Revolution had been, at best, only a political revolution. The underlying economic structures had remained essentially unchanged. Association, flexible and dynamic association, and remember how chary Proudhon was of any form of association, if used as a means and not as an end in itself, could help to bring about this social republic. The root of association is contract, and contract, a horizontal form of relationship between equals, opposes government, a vertical relationship between unequals. Proudhon writes, the idea of contract excludes that of government. Between contracting parties, there is necessarily a real personal interest for each. A man bargains with the aim of securing his liberty and his revenue at the same time. Between governing and governed, on the other hand, no matter how the system of representation or delegation of the governmental function is arranged, there is necessarily an alienation of part of the liberty and means of the citizen. Contract horizontalizes the vertical and makes the involuntary and unfree into the voluntary and free. The new order, then, is modelled on economic rather than political patterns. Practically, the realization of this ideal will involve decentralization and some form of federalism, as well as worker control of the means of production. What of law and order? How shall this be supplied in the absence of coercive government? Proudhon tells us, in place of laws we will put contracts. No more laws voted by a majority, not even unanimously. Each citizen, each town, each industrial union makes its own laws. In place of political powers we will put economic forces. In place of the ancient classes of nobles, burghers and peasants, or of businessmen and working men, we will put the general titles and special departments of industry. Agriculture, manufacture, commerce, etc. In place of public force, we will put collective force. In place of standing armies, we will put industrial associations. In place of police, we will put identity of interests. In place of political centralization, we will put economic centralization. Do you see now how there can be order without functionaries? A profound and wholly intellectual unity. You, who cannot conceive of unity without a whole apparatus of legislators, prosecutors, attorney generals, customs house officers, policemen, you have never known what real unity is. What you call unity and centralization is nothing but perpetual chaos, serving as a basis for endless tyranny. It is the advancing of the chaotic condition of social forces as an argument for despotism, a despotism which is really the cause of the chaos. Well, in our turn, let us ask, what need have we of government when we have made an agreement? Does not the National Bank, with its various branches, achieve centralization and unity? Does not the agreement among farm labourers for compensation, marketing and reimbursement for farm properties create unity? From another point of view, do not the industrial associations for carrying on the large-scale industries bring about unity? And the constitution of value, that contract of contracts, as we have called it, is not that the most perfect and indissoluble unity? So writes Proudhon. There is so much here that echoes down the corridors of anarchism, and almost everything Proudhon proposes, with the possible exception of economic centralization, would be acceptable to libertarian anarchists. Law will be replaced by arbitration, education will be a matter for parents and teachers, and everywhere, almost everywhere, decentralization, including the decentralization of nation-states. In 1849, Proudhon was arrested for insulting Louis Napoleon and was confined in prison until 1852. On his release from his not very onerous confinement, Proudhon soon found himself in trouble with the authorities again. The official reaction to his publication of Justice in the Revolution and in the Church encouraged his flight over the border to Belgium. Proudhon developed some more concrete political ideas in his 1863 work, The Principle of Federation, in which federal forms of association replaced nationalism. Proudhon's anarchism wasn't violent, but tended towards the idea of a society's organizing itself on the basis of spontaneous, self-governing producers. From here to the notion of federation was a short step. Bohl remarks that Proudhon's self-governing federal society was incompatible with industrial capitalism, but given Proudhon's suspicions of industrial society in the first place, this wouldn't have been problematic for him. Although anarchy, society without government, has been the predominant mode of social organization for most of human history, its very predominance meant that it was theoretically invisible, so that it had rarely if ever been reflectively appropriated and rationally expressed. Just as one can reason without learning logic, and speak without formally learning grammar, so one can live in anarchy without being able to speak or write about anarchism. Proudhon was the first person to coin the term and to describe himself as an anarchist, saying, "Although a firm friend of order, I am, in the full sense of the term, an anarchist." The position he espoused must, in all justice, be described as a form of anarchism, although its attitude to property diverges sharply from that of anarcho-communism, anarcho-collectivism, and anarcho-syndicalism. As we have seen, Proudhon is notorious for his epigram that property is theft, which would seem to place him in the company of anarcho-communists. However, Proudhon also said that property is liberty. How may these statements be reconciled? In fact, Proudhon used the term property in one sense to denote and to deprecate the idea of ownership by those who had no continuing contact with what it was they allegedly owned, whereas he had no difficulty with the idea that land belonged to those who actually used or possessed it. This idea that property was legitimate only to the extent that it was in actual possession and use was to loom large in the thought of some of the American individualists, Josiah Warren and Benjamin Tucker. This is hardly surprising in the case of Tucker, given the enormous influence Proudhon's writings had on him. However, Warren's thoughts on this matter were completely independent of, and indeed prior to, Proudhon's. Property, writes Proudhon, is the suicide of society. Possession is a right, property is against that right. Suppress property while maintaining possession, and by this simple modification of the principle, you will revolutionize law, government, economy, and institutions. You will drive evil from the face of the earth. Proudhon distinguished sharply between one form of property, let's call it property C, inasmuch as it was the outcome of conquest or exploitation, and maintained only by the exercise of state power, and property L, inasmuch as it was the outcome of labour and intrinsically independent of state power for its maintenance. The former kind of property is theft. The latter is freedom. Proudhon's mutualism, unlike the communist and collectivist forms of anarchism, defends private property, property L, provided that fundamental human equality is not thereby endangered. In common with other forms of anarchism, mutualism rejects the state. In place of the state, mutualism allows at best a federation of free communes. The economic system is to be based upon the free association of individual workers or, when the nature of their work required it, some kind of syndicalist arrangement. The products of individual workers and cooperatives would be traded in the market. Mutualism also proposed the disruption of the system of state-sponsored banking monopoly and the provision of a system of free credit. Property L that is to counteract the power of the state, and in so doing to ensure the liberty of the individual. Proudhon's concessions to private property, limited as they were, and his exaltation of it as a bulwark against the state, weren't well received by some other anarchists. Other aspects of his mutualism also fell under suspicion. Kropotkin was as opposed to a mutualist form of money and credit as he was to any other form of money and credit, and Bakunin ridiculed the mutualist idea of contract or convention as implying the idea that individuals were, before such conventions, pre-social. If the anarcho-communists and anarcho-collectivists think that Proudhon makes too many concessions to property and individual rights, others might think that he hasn't gone far enough. Mutualism is opposed to what Proudhon regards as the theft of labour, but by allowing currently unused land to be reappropriated, it could be claimed that labour invested in the land by the owner not currently in possession has been misappropriated. Mutualists, in turn, find the libertarian anarchist theory of property acquisition or property justification to be less than convincing, and along with Georgists, ancient and modern, and latter-day left libertarians, reject the idea that land can ever be property in a full-blooded sense, since it is not the product of labour. Summary. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon is one of the most important social and political thinkers of the 19th century. His ideas on anarchy, property, land and labour influenced almost all subsequent thinkers, whether they adopted them, or rejected them. What is property opens with the notorious claim that property is theft. This claim is not a universal condemnation of all and every form of property. What it condemns is property inasmuch as it is employed by someone to exploit the labour of others without effort on the property owner's part. If Stirner is the egoistic individualist, Proudhon could be said to be the social individualist. In the absence of a coercive government, law and order will be supplied by each citizen. In place of public force, collective force. In place of standing armies, industrial associations. In place of police, identity of interests. In place of political centralization, economic centralization. Proudhon's anarchism wasn't violent. but tended towards the idea of a society's organizing itself on the basis of spontaneous, self-governing producers. From here to the notion of federation was a short step. In common with other forms of anarchism, Proudhon's mutualism rejects the state. In place of the state, mutualism allows, at best, a federation of free communes. The economic system is to be based upon the free association of individual workers, or, when the nature of their work required it, some kind of syndicalist arrangement.